So welcome to the Owning Your Story session. I'm your facilitator today. So you had the opportunity to get a glimpse of my life through the keynote. So over the last 2 years, I've been fortunate enough to tell others my story through various mediums, a podcast, a TEDx talk, online column, public speaking. So my family and I, before we started on this journey, we had to make the decision to make this a public endeavor. And it's not something that should be taken lightly because there are some things you have to take into account. So with this session, you have a handout that you will be using to follow along with the presentation. And I noticed that the handout is up, but I actually have a presentation that's separate, but we will wing it, we'll make it happen. So as we start, I think that actually because the presentation is different, I'm just going to go ahead and speak as though the presentation is up, and then we'll move the handout as needed. So in order to own your story, what we've learned, you have to first advance your why. But first, we have to figure out what exactly is your why. I'm going to stand by the laptop because we're all about being agile. So what is your why? When we start that step one before anything, what is your why? It's not an easy question. It's not something I expect for you all to know if you don't know it already and figure it out in this session and life is just easy peasy. It's more of this session is meant to be contemplative. So I allow for notes in the handouts to just really think through what you think it should be. Because the reason why the why is important is because it should ideally be as consistent as possible, regardless of the medium. For us, we want to show a story of a family who's human first, neurodivergent, and everything else second. That's our why. Our why is to do it authentically and not in a way that makes people think that everything is great all the time. That is our why. Your why obviously could look differently for you in your situation. It's definitely steeped in who you are. So I'm an advocate and I'm a lifetime caregiver. That's the lens that I focus through. I'm not trying to speak in the shoes of a self-advocate. I think we have historically gotten into a lot of trouble. Those of us that are advocates trying to move into self-advocacy territory. So those are the type of things to keep in mind. It's not an easy journey, but the journey into self-actualization equals better advocacy overall and more consistent. I call this, I blame my corporate America background, legal background, internal audit. But it's one of a different kind, right? It's looking within yourself and conducting your own audit report and asking yourself some really tough questions, right? And they're all types of questions. One is, okay, did you experience some trauma as a child? How did it affect you? What did that look like? Where have you lived in the world? Where have your loved ones lived? Has that impacted your life? You may think it doesn't mean much, but it does, because once you go public, you have to figure out what audiences you're targeting and why. Me growing up in the Midwest helped. Me growing up in an area where I'm the first, I'm the only, helps. I didn't see it at the time whether or not it would help. But I'm willing to enter spaces, all different types of spaces, based on how I grew up. So what does that look like for you? Another thing that I mentioned in the keynote is the importance of recognizing recurrent themes. What are recurrent themes to you? Recurrent themes to me in my life: cultural stigma, autism, neurodivergence, disability, sometimes being excluded from places, from rooms, from parts of society, advocacy. What are your recurrent themes? A huge recurrent theme for me also is finding hope in dark places. Not bragging, I got a PhD in that. Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Please, thank you.
Oh, sure, sure. I'm sorry, did I miss that table?
No, there's someone who's come in a little late.
Oh, okay.
Early enough.
No, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Sorry about that. So these are just some of the questions that I would like you to really think about. And I want to give 10 minutes, again, knowing that this is not something that you could finish in 10 minutes, but at least just start to think through what that could look like for those that are starting their own advocacy journey. Because remember, the moment you share your story, it affects other people. And you have to really make sure that you have the building blocks in place. Because we have this uncanny ability to influence others, and that could be either negatively or positively. So this is not a decision to be taken lightly. And again, I'm not trying to scare anybody who hasn't started yet, but it's something to really be thoughtful about. Because over time, this will become a body of work. So I know we're short on time. Originally, I was thinking 15 minutes, but let's do 10 minutes of just contemplating, and we will move on. Oh, sure. Understood. Where have you lived? How has where you have lived affected you? When you were a child, what did you absolutely love doing? Do you have an opportunity to regularly participate in those activities in the present day? Did you grow up in a loving, supportive home? If so, or if not, how did that shape you? What significant trauma have you been through or are currently going through? How have you addressed it? What tools do you use to address the pain while still in it? What recurrent themes have you recognized throughout your life? Are these themes an opportunity to teach others about any lessons you have learned from them? What breaks your heart and why? Why do you think it affects you so much? And for this presentation, I sent ahead the presentation ahead of time. So some were able to convert this into a more accessible form, and I apologize for those that were not able to do so. Sure. Okay. So on the presentation, it's slide 6. So they're the same questions. Yeah, so I will actually, as I'm going through, I will. Sure. So the presentation is slide 6. So they're the same questions. Thank you. Just getting my timer together. I know we're running short on time, so I'm actually going to give about 3-4 more minutes and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to keep moving as we go along. To cue you up on the presentation for the next segment, it would be slide 10 on the presentation. So hopefully you've gotten some ideas, things like geography, things like major life events, recurrent themes. Give you some examples for me. I sit before you as a Nigerian American Midwesterner, East Coaster, Southerner. So, as I mentioned in my keynote, first generation American, born and raised in Illinois, went to law school out in DC, completely different culture. Then I brought my husband back as a souvenir to the Midwest. I did that. We lived in Illinois for a while. Then we moved to Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. Then we moved from extreme cold to extreme heat, Dallas, Texas, of where I sit today. And who knows where I'll be in 3-4 years. I've learned to take life one day at a time. But all of those geographies have helped form me and helped shape how I can speak to very different audiences. Also, the type of jobs I've had have definitely changed. I've gone from the government sector to the private sector, different stakeholders, different audiences. how do I make sure my why stays consistent when the audience changes? So, sorry for more deep reflection. We'll narrow this down to 5 minutes because I know I started late. I was talking too much at the beginning to all of you individually. I'm sorry. So, with that in mind, not trying to get you guys all up in your feelings, but I kind of am, right? So let's look to an emotional cost-benefit analysis in your advocacy journey. So before you build your house, count the costs. What are the downsides to sharing your story? And I'll give you some of mine because I'm transparent. What could be the worst case scenario? Do you have the resources needed to handle it? And I'm not talking monetary, I'm talking emotional. What happens if your story truly resonates with an audience? Because sometimes we focus on the worst case scenario. Like, what about the best case scenario? Are you now taking yourself far away from your family? Because you're always on the road. I'm not speaking for myself. What happens if your story truly resonates? I said that already. Have you established the types of boundaries needed for you to stay the course? Now, your advocacy journey could be for a season, could be for a lifetime. Sometimes life just dictates that. We don't really know. So I can tell you a little bit about before you build your house, count the costs. And sometimes your cultural background can have something to do with it. The very first public thing I did was write an article for Medium and medium.com, and the title of the article was First My Brother, Now My Son. I didn't know about my daughter yet. So I write the article, and I think the first sentence is, sometime in 1989 my family was robbed. Because I was still angry. So I wrote that. And I then talk about how at first I was super angry, and then I started to realize, the connections. I was on the beginning of my public advocacy journey. Once I published the article, full disclosure, an aunt reached out to me and said, "Why'd you do that? You're putting our dirty laundry out there." In my culture back home, some would say there's something my grandmother did wrong in the village that caused a lineage to be like this. I had an idea of what would happen, and I published it anyway. Because I knew there were other Nigerian American Lolas who were dealing with similar things, whose relatives and friends of relatives were calling them, telling them that they're not praying hard enough. What I didn't realize was how my being public hit other people. I had a woman who, years later, I would now do the podcast, and I guess from the first episode of the podcast, she found the Medium article. And she was in Canada. She was like the Canadian Lola. And I was like, oh, there's a Canadian me. And she reached out, and our lives were so similar. And it was shocking to me. And she said, all this time I thought I was alone. I now realize I'm not alone. That is an example of the power of advocacy. But along with that really positive story, there is that negative story too. So really ask yourself, do you have the resources ready to deal with that? Because it's really important. Also, by the time we became public, I had had decades of more private advocacy. I'd lived some life. I've learned how to deal with haters. So I want to make sure others understand the mental health part of it, because as the old saying goes, success has many fathers. But on the way there, full transparency, there are people who looked down on my family when I was coming up with Kunle. Girl, after that TEDx talk, oh, Lola, I've always known you're going to be great. That's an example of if you do this journey purely because of other people's perceptions of you, it will not work long term. So really ask yourself, are you ready for the fullness of this experience, however that may look for you? I'm gonna give a couple more minutes, like literally a couple more minutes, because I don't want Karen to come in here and be like, woman. Again, oh, go ahead. I was about to. Let's give you the mic so everyone can hear the question.
I was just my question was, have you established the types of boundaries needed for you to stay the course? You had that box. Can you give a little flavor to that?
I got flavor. So, boundaries can change over time. At first, I thought I had more capacity than I initially had, so like, yeah, whoever comes and asks me, I'll help them. Then you'll be surprised how the floodgates open. So then it becomes, okay, how can I best help given the time restraints? And I've done that through transparency. There's a woman who reached out to me and said she's looking for private schools focused on autism in Maryland. I don't live in Maryland. So I connected her with people I knew and let her know that you might not hear from me for about a week or so because I have a lot going on. Put it in my calendar to make sure I give people the proper time frames that are realistic for me. Sometimes you just have to give a hard no. And I gave a sigh because I'm about to tell you a story. So there was a woman, Nigerian American like me. She really connected with my story. She has a son on the spectrum, very young, like 3, 4. She's just at the beginning of her journey. She's moving to Texas. I told her, don't do it. So you all know what I told her, don't do it. She proceeds. Before she gets here, she narrowed it down. I gave her a list of questions I ask ABA therapists. She then reaches out to me again and says, before I get there, I've narrowed it down to 5 in the DFW area, Dallas-Fort Worth area. I said, that's wonderful. Can you go to each Can you go to each therapy center on my behalf? Because I know you'll know which one is good. I said I gave you the list of questions. I gave you preferred providers in our area. I cannot go to 5 different centers. That's an example of a hard no. But again, I try and do it with grace each time because I know that when you're, especially when you're at the beginning of that journey, it's a lot to process. It's very overwhelming. That's a great word for it. But I cannot sacrifice my mental health, especially when I just got it back, y'all. I mean, I cannot do that. And I know that's an example of a set boundary I have. And I'm an advocate. I'm a lawyer. I can't even, some people want me to practice law on their behalf. I work at a company where I have a contract. I cannot practice law on the side. My children need to eat. So I keep all of those things in line, and I let people know that. That's a good segue into tailoring to the audience. Hold on, let me make sure that's slide 11, how to tailor in the presentation. How to tailor your why to the relevant audience. So, we got some more self-reflection again. So after you've determined your why, and again, I know it's not something you could do quickly in a breakout session, but maybe you're starting to have those introductory nuggets for those that don't know their why yet. Have you thought of how your message can be delivered through various audiences? So my particular story, for instance, is vast. Like the layers got layers, 30 years worth of this, right? So knowing that, I realized that there are segments of it that could be portioned off and targeted to the audience in ways I didn't even fully understand. A good example is there was a podcast episode where I talk about my daughter's birth story in more detail. You don't know who's listening to your message. A woman who I went to high school with, who's now a neonatal surgeon, reaches out to me and says, Lola, I'm playing your podcast episode to my residents so they better understand Black maternal care. Think about that. I'm putting this out into the world thinking this is autism and disability. She hears it differently. These are the things you have to keep in mind. There's another episode I mentioned, Healthline Media, which is an online publication centered on all different types of healthcare issues, including mental health care. Again, you don't know who's listening. The editor-in-chief of a division of Healthline Media, somebody who I went to law school with, reaches out and says, would you consider writing a column for PsychCentral.com? She hears my podcast and thinks mental health. I'm thinking autism and disability and a narrative, like a family's narrative, and other people are hearing different things. So again, keep that in mind in your journey. The consistency of your why is really important, because if you stick to what you know is true, it will not only benefit the population you think you're targeting, but I call it micro-targeting allyship in areas you have no idea. Now there's also a part of this journey back to making sure you're being your authentic you. I know I'm a decent writer, so I said, yes, I could write a column. I wrote in a past life for another online publication. Not that you can't stretch yourself, but if you do go outside of your comfort zone, be okay with the occasional failure. Please be okay. I was taught to believe, coming from, I'm the daughter of immigrants, failure was a permanency. You failed. Everybody will remember that failure from 1965, even though I was born in the 80s. Like, but it's more than that. Like, you will pleasantly surprise yourself coming out of your comfort zone. So when I make this podcast, as a family, we're deciding if we should be including video, because it also helps make us more accessible. If our journey is about accessibility, ultimately, I don't like video, but it's something we're exploring. It's an example of me coming out of my comfort zone. I'm more comfortable with the written word, the spoken word, not necessarily editing video, so pray for me. But that's just an example of tailoring messages. So, another 5 minutes to think about ways in which you can convey your message. So, because variety is the spice of life, I found my full presentation and put it up here. Don't worry, your handout, we're still going back to your handout at the end if you want to take additional notes, but the handwriting portion is done if you want it to be. So, same story, different medium. I talked to you earlier about the way in which we're forming our story, and it happens to be in multiple mediums. So looking at that through that lens, looking at your own story. Those of you who are just beginning your advocacy stories, some of you are staunch veterans, but those that are beginning your story, look to see what medium you want to choose. I chose podcasting because people told me my voice was soothing, and I jokingly say that I should develop my own sleep app because I can help people soothe and just... And I thought it was an intimate form of storytelling. It's something that you can go on a long drive and listen to somebody's story. So that's why we chose podcasting as that initial. For those who want to dive deeper into the written word of things and think about the multi-generational journey, we chose writing because sometimes writing is just the best form of getting something really detailed out. Speaking, that's now developing too. Right now, I'm the main deliverer of our story, but I strongly think my son is coming up behind me. And it's more of just being more courageous, like I said, fear said with prayers, and just being authentic and telling our story in that way. But they're all different forms. They all have their uses. So I'm going to sit down for this because as I told some of you, I don't know if some of you heard earlier, I had the brilliant idea of forgetting my glasses. So it's a really good time to forget your glasses. So I'm going to sit down in front of the laptop and talk about podcast versus long form written narrative. Same story. And just a way in which we divvied up this particular story. So a lot of my stories are multi-generational. So the way in which I raise my kids is because of what I saw with my brother. So sometime in the 90s, my mom decided to fly to Nigeria alone with my brother. Now, she knew that we would have extended family members back home in Nigeria to help her take care of Kumai. The problem was getting there. So I mentioned before she's an ICU nurse. She falls asleep in the middle of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, which I don't advise. My brother was at first he was asleep, so she fell asleep, this poor woman. So he wakes up, she wakes up, she cannot find him. So I talk about this story of an autistic child getting lost in Paris, right? In this Paris airport. My mom doesn't know how to speak French. My baby brother can't talk. So I'm thinking to myself, that began a series of sensory challenges. He stopped traveling as much. Unfortunately, he's never been on a plane in years. He can go on long car rides, but beyond 2-3 hours, it gets difficult. And I saw that. I saw my brother's world shrink. So it went from international travel to maybe Wisconsin Dells from Chicago. Maybe. And I looked at my kids coming up who exhibited similar sensory challenges. So how do I encapsulate that in story form? So under the Caregiver's Chronicles, I detail literally from Charles de Gaulle to our first family vacation ever in Jamaica last December. It's a long article, y'all. And then the podcast, you have to look at the resources you have. I thought it would be more compelling if it came from my mom, what she went through in Charles de Gaulle. Unfortunately, full disclosure, we're all friends here. Zoom and my mom do not mix. Any video conferencing, any type of software beyond picking up the phone and dialing is a challenge for her. So I realized I didn't want to just narrate that, so I instead talked to her about that time, took notes, and made that our written long-form article. And I juxtaposed how my mom had no resources in Charles de Gaulle, nor no resources in travel, and juxtaposed that with, in the modern day, how American Airlines has a program, how my kids went through this like sensory practice in plane travel. This was pre-pandemic, but they would let you go through the security and you could practice getting onto a plane. They even taxied around for us. It was amazing. So I juxtaposed that and how those were the building blocks to get us to the first autism certified resort in the Western Hemisphere, Beaches Resort. So I talked about that journey from no resources at all, my brother's world shrinking, to what I'm able to do. I figured that was better in longer written form. Now for the podcast, we focused on the autism certification of resorts through my family's lens, the nuclear family I created, not the one I came from. I got to interview, and this is another thing, just do stuff afraid. I went up to the people at Beaches, like, who's your head of childcare? I said, you want to be on my podcast? She goes, okay. So I interviewed the head of childcare in Ocho Rios, Jamaica. So she's on there. I interviewed Fela. I interviewed Tosa. Alera was asleep. She was not having it, so we just kept it moving. But we talked about our trip and how life-changing it was and the practice it took us to get there. So again, same general story, but two examples of how you can tell the same story. I mentioned this earlier about advocacy versus self-advocacy. I jokingly talked about autism on autism crime. It's actually what a podcast guest referred to it, and I just love the term. But it's different in any disability we're talking about. It's making sure that everyone understands the lane we're in and doing our best not to step on others' toes, because this journey is real and it's hard, and so much of it is getting others to see our humanity, whether it is being as self-advocates or the caregivers in the situation, whether they be siblings or parents or aunts, uncles, grandparents, what have you. So if we all focus on where we fall in the rich tapestry that is this life, hopefully there'll be less division and more unity so that we can really focus on the bigger issues that a lot of us share. That's my PSA. So, examples of powerful self-advocacy I've seen on my podcast through two different lenses. I'm fascinated by the voices that we don't always focus on, like women, people of color. And there's a young woman who just made 30 under 30 at the University of Miami, 30 under 30. She's absolutely amazing. She is a self-advocate on the spectrum, started speaking later on in life, and now she's an attorney and worldwide speaker. Her name is Haley Moss, for those who want to check her out. And hopefully I will be able to play this, hopefully. But she talks about how disability is seen as a weakness in society. So hopefully I could get this 1-minute audio going.
Very much difficult to navigate with disability because it's perceived as weakness. And being perceived as weak in any way as an attorney is seen as the worst thing that could happen to you, especially if you're dealing with opposing counsel and you're a litigator. So I really wanted to unpack this, especially because so much was happening in activism and advocacy at the time, and also because I realized there was a growing interest in this topic, especially after I went viral. And I wanted to make sure that this topic was being handled properly, and what I really wanted to do when I was writing the book is I was so scared. 1, I don't want this to be an autism book. 2, I hope our profession is ready for it. And 3, I want it to be readable by anybody. That you should not have to be a lawyer to have access to certain information, including things about the ADA, including things about courts, including if you're even experiencing visiting a lawyer for the first time. So I really wanted to put all of these different life experiences and
I'm going to move on to who I call a budding self-advocate that I genuinely think you will hear about in the future. Her name is Maria Mateni. She's 12 years old, and I interviewed her with her mom, and she talked about what masking was. For those of you not in the autism community or not familiar with the term masking, is taking behaviors that are considered unconventional, some would call them quote-unquote autistic behaviors, and masking them to appear more neurotypical. So at just 12 years old, she talks about masking.
Maria, could you talk to us about masking? You mentioned that a couple of times. What does that look like for you?
So it's basically like where usually like I scan a room and see what other people are doing and how they're reacting. If it's something like something big, because let's say that there's this concert that everyone is liking, I would be like, yeah, I like that. So it's sort of like seeing what other people are doing and then tailoring your response that would fit with the person you're talking to. And you're still being yourself, but you make sure that the response would fit even if it's not what your first thought would have been, or your second thought, or just what you would have thought at all, unless you were thinking about what would be normal.
Maria, could you talk to us about...
Oh. I'm landing the plane because I don't want Karen to come in here and beat me up. So, with that in mind, the decision. For those that are still on the fence deciding whether or not their advocacy should go from private to public. Is it an easy decision? No. Definitely count the costs. Can it be rewarding? Immensely. But just make sure there's a consistent gut check. Check out that emotional cost-benefit analysis. Because at the end of the day, advocacy is key. People need to see humanity in various forms. But you have to also make sure you're ensuring that your physical and mental health is optimal. So make sure that gut check continues throughout this process. Does anyone have any additional questions and answers? Oh, no, questions, not answers. I haven't finished my coffee yet, and I did an hour-long keynote. Does anyone have any more questions? And another thing about who you are, you can tell I throw humor into stuff. I throw humor into some really hard topics, and that's just how I naturally am. So your style may be different from mine as well. I'm walking the mic over to you.
Uh-oh. Thanks. I don't really have a question, but I just wanted, for those of you that might not have observed what Lola did, that part of our advocacy journey, I think, is about understanding one another's disability and accommodation needs. And so I had struggled a little bit and asked her to read and hadn't realized that I had all the information right in front of me. And so kind of quietly and subtly, we worked it out, and she explained what she was doing. And then during one of the times when she asked us to self-reflect, came and told me that she was bringing up her presentation. And so it was just neat for me as a self-advocate, I guess, or we all have many roles, but that's kind of the one I'm adopting here, to see how that worked. I just want to, I guess, publicly thank you, Lola, but also just to share with others that what a neat example that was of how she recognized a situation and how we all, as we're working together, can accommodate one another. So,
Thank Thank you, sir. That means a lot. Oh, trying to make me cry up in here. Sure.
Hi. Hi, my name is Lori, and I don't have a question, but earlier when you were talking about autism diagnosis and how there was denial and guilt and so forth, well, first of all, in 2010, I was diagnosed with having anxiety and depression, and I have a very long story, and I'm wanting to write a book. And I keep putting it off, how do I go about it and so forth. And I also want to start my own business with natural ways to heal. Because when I went through that anxiety, doing art therapy and so forth, it helped me tremendously in music as well. But I was going to say, so I have anxiety, depression, PTSD, and then I've been seeing a therapist for about 1.5 years now, and now she tells me that I'm probably on the autism spectrum. So now I have to go to Iowa City in order to get an assessment. My frustration is with disability. I was told to quit my job, get help from family and friends, or become homeless. And that's very hard when you have a child. I'm a single parent. And at that time, my son was in high school. So I find it very important to be an advocate, to have others that will, speak out for those who don't feel like they have a voice. And like with me, I've been trying to voice my concerns and so forth, how I feel, for instance, on the Facebook platform. But I know that I need to do more. I know that I am saved from dying back in not only 2010, 2012. So I just find it important that I pursue this and, be my own advocate as well as others. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for sharing a little bit of your story. I'm sure you know this in any research you've done already, but women on the spectrum are far more likely to be misdiagnosed, and you're far more likely to think you have something else. So you're not alone.
I want to say too that when you're talking about your family, your story, a lot of times when I was younger, I felt like, what's wrong with me, because I was labeled shy. And I had a sister that was 5 years older than me, and she was an A student, and I wasn't. I was all over the place. But I was more into the arts, drawing and so forth. But it was hard because I felt like, what's wrong with me? Why am I stupid or whatever? And I remember at times where I'd seem to get in trouble, at home, and I'd go up to my room and I'd cry, and I'd be like, I just want to die. Take me. And it's very hard as a child to go through that. And I was born in 1973, so back then, mental health wasn't talked about. I knew at one point that my younger brother, that's 2 years younger than me, had dyslexia, but even that wasn't talked about. And for me, the only help that I had was I had speech therapy just a little bit in school when I was, I think, in second grade. But, we've come a long ways with mental health, but we have a lot more to go.
I completely agree. And starting your book, I just got a great tip the other day because I'm in the middle of a book as well. Sometimes it doesn't have to be writing. Sometimes just you can dictate. So start off there. Maybe when you're in the car, dictate maybe what you think about what you want to say. And then by the time a week will pass, 2 weeks will pass, a month will pass, you might have some really strong notes that can help you better put one foot in front of the other. But you're on your way, and your voice is needed. Getting my steps in today.
I just wanted to know, Lola, from a speaking standpoint, how did you, there's so many families in Iowa who are suffering on the waiver and with the MCO process, and they need help like right now. And having been through this journey with my son and my oldest son, and I was just, shh, calm down. How do you get started just going out and helping people and getting speech engagements at churches and things like that, and sharing those resources that you know that aren't on the web and aren't, because the state of Iowa hides them. Sorry.
I will neither confirm nor deny that last statement. The lawyer in me came out strong. I will neither confirm nor deny that last statement. I will neither confirm nor deny that Texas has some explaining to do. I will neither confirm nor deny. So, all joking aside, how I started was picking a medium and being consistent. And it's weird, if you build it, they will come. So, from my podcast, I had people who I had been talking to about my journey, like one-on-one. Phew! When they listened to me interview my parents and my brother, what I didn't mention in the keynote is how my other brother had his own set of challenges. Like, why am I the brother that has all the abilities? And he lived with guilt I wasn't aware of. So for me, it was the podcast. From there, churches asked me to come and talk. You don't know who's listening. TEDx Plano curator reached out to me in the midst of the pandemic. The theme of the TEDx talk was undaunted. And I just kept churning out like these heart-wrenching episodes that I thought, like, okay, it helped me. It was cathartic. And she said, when I think of undaunted, I think of you. So from that talk, the speaking engagements came. Simultaneously, I kind of bloomed where I was planted. I was already within this global banking institution that shall not be named. You could look it up on LinkedIn. And they have won Disability Inclusion Awards. So I unapologetically reached out to them via Zoom, via phone call. How did you get to where you are now? How do you help people? And I started getting more engaged in what it looks like on the employment side of things. And then people reached out to me to ask if I can be on their boards. And the board membership is what really helped me to see the community connection to things. Because before it was private, I would reach out to different people, but the board membership really helped me see through their eyes the tentacles throughout society. So I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but mine came just kind of through various channels, but once I started the podcast. So whatever medium you choose, just be consistent in it, and the opportunities to help will come.
How do I get, I've been trying to get disability since 2019. It at first was for having fibromyalgia, and now we're trying to put the anxiety, depression, PTSD in with that and so forth. But how do you get disability to actually listen and understand? I keep being told that, well, I'm young. Okay, I'm 49 years old. There's people that get disability that are younger than me. I'm told that, so it's my age, I have a college degree, and I have different job experiences. People's bodies, they change over time. And I mean, how do you get through to people like that who just want to think what they want? And, it's like, sometimes I feel like it's better if for people to be head of something if they've actually had the experience. So, any suggestions?
Yeah, about being the head of something and actually having a personal connection to it, that's actually a big problem, in my humble opinion. I think that's one of the gaps, major gaps I talked about how history was repeating itself. People who I know have been successful in finally getting what they want, they've had to go through media channels, and sometimes people would be shamed that way when in the more egregious cases. But it is, and that's what I alluded to earlier, that it's a hard journey. It's just a matter of persistence and not giving up when others do. I know it's different in every state. In Texas, for instance, there's a 14 to 18 year Texas Medicaid waiver list where I'm from. No, not where I'm from, where I live. Where I live. So it's a matter of persistence and being that squeaky wheel. And that's my very real answer. And it's not fair. I'm not going to even pretend to say it's fair. But it's a journey that we're all on, where persistence, and that's why I talk about the need for the marathon, like have the marathon mindset, because it's not, even if it's, quote, easier in a season, doesn't mean it'll be easier in the next. I'm sorry for not a better answer. Yes, so I will wrap it up now. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Take care.
Great job. Please be sure to complete your surveys. We'll collect them. Just leave them at the table when you're done. We'll collect them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lola. Great. You tired? But I'm energized too.